Hello there, I'm Nafisa Latic, and this is Across the Balkans. We start in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where one of the closest allies of Russian President Vladimir Putin, separatist Bosnian Serb leader Milorad Dodik, has won the race for president of the Serb entity. The country's election commission recounted the ballots from the October 2nd vote after claims of massive voter fraud surfaced in favor of Dodik. Although the recount confirmed his victory, election officials said they discovered several irregularities, but they were not enough to change the outcome. The Bosnian Serb leader has now secured a third term as the president of Republika Srpska, and many are wondering what direction he will take, given his growing calls for independence from state institutions. Dodik is currently under sanctions by both the US and the UK.
I will do all so that the Republika Srpska continues to be stable and to lead its own policy, to cooperate with our important partners such as Serbia, Russia, Hungary, to have the understanding of, and I will do all in the future with Jelka Svijanovic to have the sufficient understanding for us from China and some other of our friends. And of course, we will ensure the dialogue with all the others across Europe and the world in order to have our agenda presented and implemented in the right way.
Meanwhile, concerns are growing over changes to Bosnia and Herzegovina's election law. Thousands gathered to protest against the decision imposed by the country's High Representative Christian Schmidt on the night of the elections. Protesters demanded he either annul the decision or be dismissed. They say the changes give the Croat Nationalist Party, HDZ, a disproportionate degree of political influence. Croatian officials in Zagreb have welcomed the Schmidt's decision and said they had personally lobbied him to impose the changes for years. A lot to unpack following the elections in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Let's bring in Damir Kapidzic, who will help us understand the impact of the results. He is an associate professor of comparative politics at the University of Sarajevo. Damir, hello. Welcome to the program.
Hello, and thanks for inviting me.
Now, what does 4 more years of Milorad Dodik mean for the future of Bosnia?
Well, the 4 years that he's starting now is a continuation of what he was doing before he was a member of the presidency, which means that he will be largely focusing on what's going on in Republika Srpska and only partially on what is going on in international affairs. Now, this does also mean that he will be strongly advocating for more independence of Republika Srpska, or at least more autonomy in a way. How far he will go, well, that's the big question.
Let's not forget that we are talking about a man who is sanctioned by the US and UK for his separatist agenda. But he does have strong support from Russia's Vladimir Putin. How much did Vladimir Putin's support help Dodik win?
Well, I'm not sure that it helped or if it sort of hindered his, let's say, more clear victory, because in this sense, Russia is not a big trade partner of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the influence of Russia beyond cultural influence is fairly limited. So in this sense, having only Russia as a partner is something that does not fare well for Republika Srpska. You always need European partners. You always need the West. And this is something that Dodik has also come to realize. He's not explicitly going on a simply just pro-Russian agenda against Western interests.
He is not true. And how different will his position as the president of the Serb entity be in comparison to his stint in the presidency of Bosnia?
Well, he will be focusing more on affairs in Republika Srpska, that's for sure. When he was part of the presidency, he had a more outsized international role. So we might see less of him in the upcoming 4 years. But we will probably not see less of his policies, because those will translate onto the state level and also through his party colleague who is in the presidency, Jelka Svijanovic.
What do you think EU officials will do when it comes to growing Russian influence in Bosnia and Herzegovina in the wake of the conflict in Ukraine? Now, with Dodik back as the president of Republika Srpska, can we expect some kind of sanctions from Brussels as well, following the US and the UK?
Well, if there will be a clear pro-Russian push in Republika Srpska, I think we can expect some sanctions. But what we see now is a more active and pro-European role, trying to bring Bosnia back towards Europe, to put it that way, and leave it outside this limbo where Russia can actually have a more outsized influence. Bringing it closer to Brussels, London, and Washington will essentially also diminish the role that Russia can play in the country.
Damir, lots of tensions in the other entity, the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, lots of protests and tensions around the changes of the election law imposed on the election night by the High Representative Christian Schmidt. Why now? And will these changes bring more instability in the future?
Yes, I think there's a lot to unpack there as well, because the changes are one thing, the way that it changed the election law, and actually it made the formation of government a more streamlined affair. But on the other hand, imposing such a decision on election night without any prior consultation with citizens as such is something that is highly undemocratic and that should have been avoided.
Now, Croatia's leadership says they are welcoming these changes, that they have lobbied for this. But does this mean Zagreb actually intervened in Bosnia's future in some way?
Well, I would actually say that Zagreb is also partially unhappy with the changes. It's just that they cannot express this. They have to show that they made an effort, at least. I'm not sure that Zagreb got all what it wanted. Even on the contrary, nobody's really happy with the changes that were imposed, which basically means that everybody's partially satisfied. Now, what the changes do is they essentially strengthen the role of Croats in the decision-making process, in the legislative process, but they also limit policies on which they can exert outsized influence. So it's a sort of win-win or lose-lose situation, depending on how you see it.
Will these changes slow down or speed up the formation of the government following the elections?
I think that they can only speed it up, because slowing it down, this is something that we have had for the past 20-ish years. And basically moving forward from that, any change would have been good.
Is Bosnia heading towards more instability in the upcoming months, especially in the wake of everything that's going on in Europe at the moment?
Definitely. I mean, we can probably see more instability, but this will be political instability. We are not talking about security or violence becoming an issue. We might also see instability in relation to economic concerns, rising inflation, and security of commodities and gas prices. But this political stability is something to watch out for, because if government formation does not follow this newly imposed law, especially in the federation, this is something that can then produce also political instability and possible future intervention.
And are you optimistic? Can we see Bosnia going forward with the EU candidate status, or even joining NATO in the wake of the war in Ukraine?
Joining NATO is probably not an option, because you do have part of the country, the Serb population, which is vehemently opposed to this. But going forward with EU integration is a real possibility, especially now, since you see a stronger interest from the European Union to incorporate Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now, membership will always, or the path to membership will always be a political decision made in Brussels, independent of what is actually done in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
And Damir, just briefly, what's the mood like at the moment in the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina following the elections? Any more optimism?
Very cautiously optimistic. I mean, people see that it's a lot of what we have already had, a lot of the same. But at the same time, you see that there is an idea that you can ask for more from politicians. Now, the question is, will they deliver?
Damir Kapidžić, thank you so much for being our guest on Across the Balkans.
Thank you.
It's time to look at some other stories making headlines in the region. Kosovo's Prime Minister Albin Kurti announced he will postpone implementing a government decision on compulsory license plates. Kosovo urged the drivers with Serbian plates to change them with Kosovar ones starting from November 1st. The move has been met with strong and sometimes violent resistance by local Serbs who live in the country's north.
Vi ovde porate moje će bien, In the first 3 weeks of next month, from November 1st to November 21st, all those illegal car plates will be rebuked. From November 21st for the next 2 months, they will be fined according to law. From January 21st until April 21st, they can use some temporary car plates, but not the old plates Kosovska Mitrovica. We are not changing our decision. This means the decision will start to be implemented from November 1st. But sanctions will be implemented gradually for those who will not respect the law and the government decision.
As part of her Western Balkans tour last week, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen visited Bosnia and Herzegovina for the first time since the country was recommended for EU candidate status. She reaffirmed the bloc's support, saying the doors are always open. She also expressed support for EU visa liberalization for Kosovo citizens during her visit to Pristina. Von der Leyen announced the European Union has pledged over $500 million to improve energy infrastructure in the Western Balkans. Several countries have already declared an energy emergency in anticipation of shortages in the coming months.
We are putting forward now an energy package, a support package for the whole Western Balkan. It begins with grants, 80 million grants here for North Macedonia as immediate budget support. It will help address the impact of the high energy prices on your citizens and on your businesses. And we will finalize this by the end of the year so that you can get the funding already in January.
Now to another country in the region that is finding itself caught between Russia and the West, Serbia. President Aleksandar Vucic has welcomed the European Commission's move to postpone its decision on whether to exempt the Western Balkan countries from the Russian oil ban to December. Vucic blamed the neighbouring Croatia for initiating Brussels' decision to include the Western Balkans in the ban in the first place. Croatian Prime Minister Andrej Plenković denies this, saying it is the EU's position, not theirs, and that Belgrade can import any oil via Croatian ports, except if it comes from Russia. Serbia, an EU candidate country, has refused to impose sanctions on Moscow for its attack on Ukraine. Veljko Skenderia has more on the tensions between the neighbours.
The EU's decision to ban the transport of Russian oil across its territory has led to an angry exchange between the leaders of Serbia and Croatia. Serbia, one of the few European countries that have not joined EU sanctions on Moscow, imports all of its oil from Russia. And until recently, it had hoped that Croatia's pipeline operator JANAF would continue to ship Russian crude oil. But with the latest sanctions agreement, this came to an end.
Mi ćemo morati da se snađemo na drugi način, da platimo višu cenu i to nema velike filozofije. Što se tiče uvođenja ili neuvođenja sankcija, ponovit ću vam još jednom. Niste vi ti iz Hrvatske, ni vi, ni vaše rukovodstvo koji ćete da vodite politiku Republike Srbije. Politiku Srbije vodit će građani Srbije preko slobodno izabranih predstavnika, a protiv svih onih koji misle da mogu Srbiji da nameću svoju volju.
While Serbia says Croatia is to blame for this decision, Croatia's Prime Minister denied these accusations at the informal European Council meeting in Prague.
It's not our position, it's the position of the European Union. I think every country that comes here at this event, at this point of time, at European history, should, one, respect the sanctions regime against Russia, second, show solidarity to Ukraine. Serbia can anytime import any oil except from Russia, bring it to the Croatian port of Krk, then bring it through our pipeline system to Serbia. No problem.
Although it is quite clear that Croatia is only implementing what was agreed in Brussels, Belgrade has compared Croatia with the NDH, a World War II-era puppet state founded by the Nazis. Relations between the two countries are at their lowest ebb since the ex-Yugoslavia wars from the 90s.
Of course, Zagreb is not without fault here either, but judging from their much milder tone, actions by Croatian leaders towards Serbia seem more indifferent and often comes with a patronizing attitude. There seems to be no real, sincere desire and will to normalize the relations on either side.
And while Croatia waves its hand as if what is happening with its eastern neighbor is none of its concern, Serbian politicians, and especially the media, are busy raising the tension.
Što se tiče srpskih građana, zapravo je došlo već odavno do normalizacije. Međutim, državna politika i osobito Aleksandar Vucic koriste, ja bih rekao, svojevrsne stereotipe koji prije svega dvije nacije definiraju kao izvorne i nekakve najveće neprijatelje Srbije.
Vucic insists on the policy of sitting on two stools. Even Serb representatives in Croatia are sending signals that such an approach is not good and only isolates Serbia. Such policies may have been possible before the conflict in Ukraine. But now, Vucic is expected to clearly choose a side.
Croatian analysts also warn of another major problem for the Serbian president: deciding where Belgrade stands on the issue of Kosovo's statehood without causing divisions within Serbian society.
Srbija nema riješeno državno pitanje. Mislim, Hrvatska bi bila u ovoj poziciji da je recimo ostala obsesija proširenjem na neke teritorije u Bosni i Hercegovini ili tako nešto. Mislim, zamislite da nemamo jasnu predodžbu, ne bi ni mogli ući u Europsku uniju u takvim uvjetima. Znači, jako je važno da Hrvatska nema nikakvih dvojbi o tome šta je naš državni okvir. Srbija ne zna.
Raspoloženje u Republici Srbiji je jednim dijelom i proeuropsko, zapadno, ali je i jako prorusko. Znači, svako opredjeljivanje ili za A ili za B proizvešće lomove unutar samog srpskog društva, proizvešće lomove unutar identiteta.
Milorad Pupovac is the Serbs' political leader in Croatia. He says while Serbia can have ties with the other countries, its main focus must be the EU. And on whether Serbia should impose sanctions on Russia, Pupovac chooses his words carefully, but the answer is clear. Belgrade must harmonize its foreign policy with that of the Union.
Ne vjerujem da to može biti preko noći, ali da može biti i da treba biti u nekoj dinamici koja će biti podešena sa interesima Republike Srbije i sa očekivanjem Europske unije sigurno.
But Pupovac also warns that the EU is no longer as popular in Serbia, not just because of its kindred feelings towards Russia, but more so because it feels this area of Southeast Europe has been long forgotten by Brussels. It might be reasonable to think that the EU should therefore speed up Serbia's integration. And while Serbia struggles to decide which chair to sit on, the diplomacy of both interested parties is not resting. Russian Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs Aleksandar Grushko recently met with Vucic in Belgrade. Brussels, on the other hand, is playing a carrot and stick game. On the one hand, it's given signals that it may freeze or even terminate Serbia's negotiations for EU membership unless it aligns its foreign policy and imposes sanctions on Russia. On the other hand, it recently granted $165 million to help Serbia cope with the energy crisis. And while Vucic weighs in, both sides expect an answer to the question, Quo vadis Serbia, sooner rather than later. Veljko Skenderija, TRT World, Zagreb, Croatia.
We are now going to jump into something a bit more cultural and creative. Balkan music is known across the world for its high energy and addictive rhythms. The genre began to gain popularity across Europe more than a decade ago, and now it's reached all the way to Japan. For a country that barely has any historical connections or interactions with the Balkans, it came as a surprise to many after Balkan music started gaining traction there.
I like to move it.
One musician has been trying to spread Balkan rhythms to the rest of the world for decades. He started a club trend called Balkan Beats, which is a blend of Balkan ethno sounds with electronic music. His name is Robert Soko. He left his native Bosnia before the outbreak of the war in the 90s and moved to Berlin. he says he was never really a fan of Balkan music until he left his home. And today, his music has become a global success, performing at concerts from Istanbul to Tokyo. Robert Soko is sometimes referred to as the godfather of Balkan beats, and he is our guest today. Thanks, Robert, for joining us on Across the Balkans. First of all, give us more details about Balkan beats trend. How did you come up with the idea?
It happened by coincidence, like I would say many other good things happened to be created back in the 90s when a lot of young people, mostly refugees and mostly from Bosnia and Herzegovina, flocked into Germany. A lot of them landed in Berlin. I was a cab driver, and I was like, okay, we were starting to hang out in a certain bars in Berlin, Kreuzberg, and this is where I decided, it was 1993, to eventually play some music we grew up with. And that was actually the initial impulse in how we started creating Balkan Beats parties.
I've listened to some of your music. There's a lot of traditional songs from the Bosnian history, lots of Sevdalinka, as we call it. And I've read somewhere that you didn't like it before, but that you started to like it even more when you left the country. And that happens to all of us who moved out from Bosnia.
That's true. It's a sort of a phenomenon. I mean, when you are young, of course, you are not necessarily inclined to the music of old people, to traditional music. You are rather, a rebellion, and you don't want to listen to this. You want to listen to something new. But once I found myself in the Western world, in my case in Germany, I started liking it. And I grew up with Sevdah music, and this is something what was, somehow part of my identity, even without knowing it back in time as a young man. This is how I, fell in love with this, and still nowadays just, love singing it.
Describe to us the reaction when you got to Tokyo and when you played Balkan Beats music. That's extraordinary. We don't have many people living in Japan from this part of the world. And what's the connection? How did they connect with the music?
Well, at some point, I think Balkan Beats has become a European/global phenomenon. And the Japanese youngsters or artists love discovering European trends. And by coincidence, I happened to meet some of these Japanese artists who would then embrace the idea of producing the parties of the same style. It was mostly people from the art scene, fashion designers, etc. And back to your question, how did they react? It's an interesting reaction. For my taste, it was a little bit goofy, a little bit fake, because Japanese would follow the rhythm no matter what you play, more or less. And it was definitely crazy, but I could not really tell that they have the real feeling for this. Yes, it was successful for a period of time.
Balkan music is known to have a very strong influence from its Ottoman heritage. How would you describe this music? How complex is the rhythm?
Well, the rhythm, what we play mostly is upbeat music. So you have to have a rhythm to keep the crowd dancing. But if you top it up with some, let me call it oriental melodies, then it creates an interesting mixture of melody and sentiment and harmony, and makes you somehow feel a bit different, speaking about us here in Western Europe, so to speak. And it's definitely lovely. And for some reason, in the end of 90s, beginning of the 0 years, a lot of young, also German and other foreigners to this culture would embrace it and really fall in love with it. And I think, Balkan Beats, as you said before, is really rooted in the Oriental culture. So we recognize it in the melodies. A lot of Ottoman, Arabic, Persian music has been incorporated in this, recited to some extent, and then, represented to the world. And Europeans love discover something new. There is something imperialistic about this, like, wow, this is something new. It's cool to have it. well, I guess this could be an answer to your question.
Robert, great to have you with us, and I wish you luck with your Balkan Beats project. And if you haven't yet, do check out Balkan Beats on music platforms. Thanks for watching Across the Balkans. See you next time. Bye-bye for now.